All right, well, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started on time today. Hey, we are actually 2 minutes ahead of normal time. 3 minutes. It's 10:07. I'm pretty excited about that. Can anybody note that? Where's my secretary? Note that? No, he's keeping minutes. Okay, so today we're actually going to look at a question that Carol brought up last Sunday and kind of walk through some of that stuff that Carol brought it up and then Doug kind of pointed it out, and interesting stuff here, I think, in terms of what Jesus does. So we were in Mark chapter 4, and we're going to kind of look at really the same thing Jesus does in his temptations in Matthew chapter 4, where he draws from the Old Testament, brings it into picture, and these people know what he's saying, and they know what that context is, what that section is, what it's referring to. And so we're going. But before we do this, I was thinking about something last night that had just simply never occurred to me, because usually when we think of Jesus and him throwing stuff out, he's talking to an audience, he's speaking to someone, and he's, whether it's a parable or just a straight up teaching or responding to something. And then, in his temptations in Matthew 4, and this may only be interesting to me, I don't know, who is he talking to there? He's having a conversation with the devil. There's no people, there's no crowd, there's no anybody there. And so his response of going back to the Old Testament 3 times, Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 8, is in this conversation with the devil. And I know that sounds really kind of simplistic, but it just never occurred to me. There's nobody there except for, the devil in that conversation they have. Anyway, all right, so in Mark chapter 4, when they are stating about him that he's doing what he's doing by the power of Beelzebub, okay, so that was in Mark chapter 3. In Mark chapter 4, he gives the parable of the sower and shares this parable. And for all of you that are listening, it's something that you've heard a few bazillion times. It is actually kind of a fun thing to teach. And after he gets done, he is alone, and his followers, along with the 12, it says, began asking him about the parables. And so I think verse 10 is something that we need to at least highlight, if not be aware of, is kind of his whole point. And if you connect verse 9 and verse 10, after he tells the parable, he then says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And the idea here of hearing is kind of in humor with, men and women. If a husband and wife are having a conversation, and sometimes, the idea that a man hears, but he's not, what? Listening. And so this hearing isn't just hearing, but it's the idea of listening, comprehending, assimilating, processing, all those kind of things. So if you have ears, if you have the ability to comprehend what I'm saying, do that. Let him hear. Let him assimilate. Let him process what is being said. So whenever he was alone, in other words, the crowds had left, apparently, and his basic disciples and his 12 began asking him about the parable. And so notice here again the togetherness, the connection of verse 9 and verse 10. They're doing what he suggested they do. We're not getting this parable. We're not understanding this. So they begin asking him about the parable. They want to assimilate it. They want to process it. The others got it and just took off. And so he tells them, to you. And I don't think it's just because it's his followers, disciples, and the 12, but to you who are interested and curious and want to know. The mystery of the kingdom of God has been given. You are curious, you want to know more, you want to grow, etc. So this mystery or this secret of the kingdom of God. But to those who are outside, those who aren't curious, aren't interested, do not really want to assimilate, everything comes in parables. And remember the word parable, parabole, is a teaching that like walks next to you. It is something that you can grasp and take hold of. Everything comes in parables. I say grasp and take hold of. Everything is in parables. It's in pictures and ideas, but you still have to look and try and process it. So that while seeing, they may see and not perceive. While hearing, let me go back to the NIV here. And of course here, they, indent it in terms of understanding that it comes from an Old Testament place. They may ever be seeing but not perceiving, ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. And this may be one of those places where the translation, at least how it's stated, sounds like Jesus does not want that to happen. But he is plucking this out of Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 9. And in Isaiah 6, that famous up until verse 8, where Isaiah gets called. And you have the angel coming down, touching his tongue. Isaiah says, I'm a man of unclean lips. I'm surrounded by a people of unclean lips. And God calls him into the mission field of Israel to share this message. And in fact, if we go there, Isaiah chapter 6. And when you go back to Isaiah 6, this incredible scene where Isaiah here sees something much like we find in Revelation, I believe it is 7, where he sees the Lord high and exalted, seated on his throne. The train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each having 6 wings. He sees this vision, and all of these seraphim are saying to one another, they're calling out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." At the sound of their voices, the doorpost and the threshold shook. The temple was filled with smoke. And as a result of seeing this throne scene, Isaiah says, "Woe is to me." And notice here how he puts this. I guess I've never made the connection between here and the people that Jesus is dealing with, specifically the Jewish leadership. And he states, "I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips, and I" what? Live among people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, essentially have seen Yahweh, Adonai. And then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand. Now, we're reading through this because as Jesus mentions this, these Jewish people, as I understand it, they know Isaiah 6, and they have this scene in their head as well. This seraphim that is one of the seraphim that is talking to each other about God's holiness flew down to me with a live coal in his hand, which had been taken with tongs from the altar. So you have a reference here to the temple and the altar and sacrifices and all those kind of things that have to do with that. With it he touched my mouth and said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. His mouth, his lips are now clean. And then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And the very famous, I am here, send me. And then verse 9, he said, go and tell this people. So there's a message that's going to be given to Isaiah for these people. And this is about I looked this up. You may look it up and find a different date. About 739 BC. And in Isaiah 8, you have the proclaiming of a captivity of Assyria, which is about 5 years later, give or take. Now, those dates may not be exact, but at least that's what I found. And the reason I wanted to find that is because this statement in verse 9, Isaiah 6:9, go and tell this people, you are going to hear, but you're not going to understand. You are going to see, but not perceive. And the message that is given, the heart of the people is going to be calloused. Their ears are going to be dull. They're going to close their eyes. Because if they did open up their heart and open up their eyes, they would see, they would hear, they would understand, and they would turn and be healed. But that's not going to happen. In about 5 or 6 years from now, for Isaiah 6, they're going to be removed to captivity in Assyria. So Jesus takes this phrase, this statement, and he pulls it out of Isaiah 6, and he plants it right here in in Mark chapter 4 regarding parables. And whenever they ask him, in Mark 4, he gives this, to us that have heard this thing a bazillion times, we hear this and we're like, duh, we get it. But these folks didn't get it. And I stayed again whenever he said, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. And you remember in Isaiah 6, their choices, their heart, their attitude, they heard it, but they weren't listening. They were listening, but they did not understand because they did not want to hear Isaiah's message. So whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. They were like, look, we have ears, but we don't get this. Teach us. Help us to perceive it better. And so, much like Isaiah, Jesus is saying, I speak through parables because these people have the same heart, specifically the Jewish leadership. They can hear it, but they're not going to perceive. They're not going to understand. But if they did listen, they might turn and be forgiven. And so verse 13, Jesus said to them, and I found this interesting also, then Jesus said to them, do you understand this parable? Or don't you understand this parable? Now, I have never noticed this phrase. Don't you understand this parable? If you can't understand this, what's it say? How are you going to understand anything else? If you can't grasp what I'm teaching here, everything else is going to be, how then will you understand any parable that I give? And so there's part of this to me that is very, very interesting in terms of how Jesus responds and processes, because he tells a very simple parable, tells them in terms of their hearing. And then they pull him aside while he's alone, and they're like, we're not catching what you're giving at all. And he seems to be saying, if you're not getting this parable, the rest of them, it's almost as if this parable lays a foundation for all other teachings. In terms of the hearts, the minds, whatever you want to call it. If this is a challenge for you, the other stuff that I give is going to be a challenge as well. So you need to work on your heart, work on your perceiving, open up your mind, so to speak. And then he goes through and he actually explains the soils and the outcome of these different soils and how they are taken. Notice in verse 15, the second sentence, whenever on the path, the seed is given on the path, and obviously the path is a hard surface because it's walked on. And the seed doesn't just disappear, but Satan comes along and takes it. Satan removes that seed. And there are many times that I think as Jesus is telling a lot of stuff that he's telling, he's almost talking directly to the Jewish leadership. He is planting seeds, and Satan is removing them as soon as they're planted. He's coming along and keeping their hearts hardened so that the sowing cannot happen. And then, of course, you have the hard places and the thorny places as well. And with the thorns, the worries of life and wealth take away, they choke out the word, they make it unfruitful. So you have, 3 of the 4 here are those folks who it seems, hearing, they do not choose to listen. Even with perceiving, they are not going to understand because of their hard hearts. And in terms of bringing over the Old Testament, which has always been interesting to me, that Jesus will pluck these things out of the Old Testament and pull them into his teaching or into his lessons, into his structure, whatever you want to call it. And you find somewhat the same thing happening in Matthew chapter 4. As Jesus is being tempted, and again, it never occurred to me until actually last night that his audience, minus us, as you have a millennia of people that have been reading these things. In Matthew chapter 4, as he's being tempted, his audience is the tempter. It's Satan. It's so for the very first temptation that he gets, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. And his response to the tempter in verse 4, Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God," which is Deuteronomy chapter 6, which as Israel is going through the wilderness, and they're crying about food, and this statement comes up, man shall not live on bread alone. Trust God, he'll take care of you, he'll get you where you need to be. We know you're hungry and you're thirsty, God will take care of you. But live by God's words, live by God's instruction, God will take care of you. So if you pair up verse 3 and 4 of Matthew chapter 4, what do you think, besides maybe the surfacey stuff, that Jesus' answer to the tempter was? What was his message to him? It would obviously be important to us because it's here. What is this message Jesus is ultimately going to give to us? But he's giving it to the tempter here, to Satan. This is his response to him. What do you think the message here is? Yes.
What'd you say, Bob?
Get thee behind me, Satan.
Yes. I think one of the other processes that I find interesting here is, it's almost as if like a parent with a child that, as there's a need, it's going to be taken care of, but you need to be patient. You need to trust. And so, in this scene, Jesus is hungry. He's just fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And the option to take things in your own hands, to turn the stones into bread and eat then. Take the timeline, take the plan, all of it into his own hands. And Jesus' response, even being hungry, even being in that wilderness, it's just he and the tempter. There's nobody else there. I will trust in God's purposes and God's plan and God's steps ahead. God will feed me. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this. I'm sure you have. In verse 11, the devil left him, and messengers came and attended him. And the word, therefore, attended, if I remember, is deacon. They deaconed him. They served him. And I would assume, we can only assume here because it doesn't state, but that had to do with food and drink. And they sustained him physically after these temptations. So at the right time, God was going to take care of him. But I'm going to trust what God is doing and God's purposes as opposed to. Now, I'm getting here into Matthew chapter 4, but what I wanted you to notice is Jesus harkens back to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and the lesson that God gave through Moses to Israel at that time. Just chill. I'm going to get you food. I'm going to take care of you. And they got so out of wits that they no longer trusted God, and they just started complaining. Jesus wasn't going to complain. He wasn't going to be upset. He was going to trust God's ways. And then verse 5, the devil took him to a holy city, had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God. And I don't know if you've ever done this before. It may be a little bit of a boring study, but the ifs in the Greek language, they both escalate, but they are also, just this idea of you can show yourself to be the Son of God. You can show that you are authentic by doing X. If this is who you are, you can turn the stones into bread. If this is who you are, then you can throw yourself off the temple and you can show yourself to be the Son of God. So both of these really took the plan, the purposes that Paul talks about in Ephesians out of God's hands, out of the Father's hands, and Jesus becomes the steering wheel. He becomes the planner of what's happening for these moments. And so that's why, yeah.
And the same temptation nails the cross.
Yes. Yeah, true. Yeah. Yeah, over and over again. Yep. And even in the garden where the tempter is there, this really isn't worth it. Most of these people aren't going to follow you anyway. Why go through all this? All the different human ideas that are there. And even Jesus does the prayer. If there's another way, this is a great time to introduce it, because I really don't want to do this. So if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. And then, of course, Satan brings in this psalm and only quotes a small portion of it, that if you throw yourself down, your Father will command his angels and they will take care of you, and you will not be harmed. Verse 7, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test, Deuteronomy 6:16. So between verse 4 and verse 7 are 3 verses in Deuteronomy 6. So it's as if Jesus has taken this whole incident that happens in Deuteronomy 6 in the wilderness and brings it into this situation. I'm going to trust God, and I'm not going to put him to the test. In other words, I'm not going to tell God, look, this is a great time, and I'm going to throw myself down, and this will be a great thing to do. I'm not going to put him to the test. I'm going to continue with God's plan, bringing Deuteronomy 6 into this scene. Yeah.
It was also 40 years in the wilderness with Israelites, 40 days in the wilderness
Yep.
with Jesus, and they both are accomplishing similar, or they're both encountering similar temptations.
Yeah,
And of
yeah,
course, the Israelites
yeah.
failed, and Jesus, of course, doesn't.
Yeah.
It's almost as it's a redemptive moment. Almost.
Yeah.
It shows that Jesus shows this is the right way. This is
Right.
This is how Israel should have responded.
This is how you do it. Yeah. Yeah.
He's showing.
Yeah. Because the same presence is there. Doing really the same thing. It's just not laid out, the same way. And, to the 40-year point, the number 4 for the Hebrews is a number of, it's not just completion. It's like when you get done with the trip and you're done, or, you're going through a college degree and you graduate. It's that idea of completion, of being finished, of being done, of fruition, fulfillment, whatever you want to call it. And so after their 40 years, that process for them is done, and they then go into the promised land. And for Jesus, once these 40 days are done, the devil has had his time in this moment to try and get Jesus off his path. And it obviously doesn't work. And then one of the curious questions here, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me. And then here, away from me, Satan is obviously not a reference, but it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only, which is Deuteronomy chapter 8. And then after this, the devil leaves him and angels come and deacon him or attend him. They serve him, whatever that means. Now, Mark says that he was tempted for the entire 40 days. So for whatever reason, Matthew chooses these 3 incidents. Luke does the same thing, but he flips the last 2. One's the same, 2 and 3 get flipped in Luke. And so the whole point of this is much like Mark chapter 4, where Jesus brings in Isaiah 6 and 8. Here in Matthew 4, he brings in Deuteronomy 6. And again, it's an audience of one with the devil being here, with Satan being a part of this. And there are multiple other places where as Jesus is talking to the people, and he'll pull in the Old Testament, different lessons that were learned, different places. And I'm glad that Carol brought this up last week, because whenever these things happen, I guess the word is behooves us, a person that wants to sharpen their skills in terms of Bible study. Where is that, and what was happening in that situation? Why would Jesus and even the New Testament writer bring this into this situation? Whether it's Matthew chapter 4 or Mark 4, and these different things that are happening. And it's obviously to teach. One of the things that Terry and I have done over the years, she's a pretty huge Disney fan. I don't know how many of you guys have talked to her about that, but she grew up going to Disney. And so there are a lot of phrases in Disney movies as well as other movies, and we have situations happen and we will quote these phrases that are just both funny and they make the point we're wanting to make. And so we kind of insert those into our conversations. And that's what Jesus is doing here. All these people know these verses. They know these passages. And Jesus puts them in. And before we close, if going back to Mark chapter 4, and it's not like Jesus preps them for this. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. Let them understand this parable. And they're like, look, we're interested and we're not getting it. This stuff has been given to you and to my disciples who are literally curious. They want to know. They're here to learn. The other folks, the ones on the outside, and I found that very interesting, that he is calling those who are, the Jewish leaders, the people that don't care, the people that are going to. In John chapter 6, do you remember what happened after Jesus gave that whole lesson? It's a really, really long lesson. And at the end, a lot of people leave because his teachings were hard, and then he asked his disciples, are you going to go too? To whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. They left. A lot of these people are going to leave. There it is. Halfway through verse 11. Secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but those on the outside. I found that very interesting that he refers to both the Jewish leadership and people that were just didn't care as those on the outside. They were Jews. And they had the Jewish descendancy, but they're on the outside. Everything is in parables. Because, this is part of sometimes where I get a little agitated with translations, is it sounds like Jesus doesn't want them to understand and perceive and be forgiven. But they're not going to listen. They're just like the people of Isaiah chapter 6. Yeah.
Well, Paul kind of addresses this as well in Romans, because he has this whole thing, Romans 9-ish,
Yeah.
9, 10, 11, where he's asking basically, did God reject Israel?
Right.
And he says, by no means, God did not reject Israel. In fact, there were an elect who received the message, who heard it and perceived it and understood it.
Right.
Obviously the apostles and the other disciples. So there were people that were, but to the rest, they were hard. That's what Paul says.
Yeah.
God didn't reject Israel.
Right.
It wasn't like this was laid out to trap them or to trick them. But it did. It became a stumbling block for them. Jesus was the stumbling block. He's just trying to say.
Yeah. The stumbling block is also
God did not reject Israel. That wasn't what was happening.
Right.
He just, there was another path.
Yeah.
And he used the Gentiles really to make the Jews jealous.
In many ways.
To bring the Jews back in, regrafted back in.
Right.
Seeds.
Right. And that's why I think it's important that we understand that that isn't Jesus saying, look, I'm speaking in parables because I don't want these people to understand or hear or be forgiven. This is, and that's why this is Isaiah 6. People haven't changed. Their hearts are the same. Their attitudes are the same. And they're not going to perceive or understand in order that they can turn and be forgiven. So same thing's happening here that happened a millennia ago with the same group of people in Isaiah chapter 6. Same stuff's happening. So, I got off on Mark 4 and Matthew 4, but that's why I wanted us to look at Isaiah 6 that he's pulling in here, and then in Matthew 4 with Deuteronomy, where Jesus pulls in the Old Testament to teach them a lesson in a way that they can get it and understand it. All right. We will, next Sunday. Yeah.